The Shadow Empresses, Rome's most wicked women and their terrible reigns of power. The story of Rome is a saga written in stone and blood, a tale of mighty legions, brilliant generals, and visionary emperors. Yet, woven into this grand narrative of masculine achievement is a darker, more intricate thread, spun by the hands of women who, despite being denied formal power, wielded an influence so profound and often so terrifying that their names have echoed through the centuries as bywords for treachery, cruelty, and insatiable ambition. These were the Shadow Empresses, the mothers, wives, and sisters of emperors, who navigated the treacherous currents of the imperial court with a ruthlessness that would make even the most hardened centurion tremble. To understand their stories is to understand the hidden mechanisms of Roman power, the subtle poisons that could fell an emperor more surely than a sword, and the enduring power of women to shape history, for better or, as was so often claimed, for worse. Our chronicle of infamy begins not with a woman who held the title of empress, but with one who, in many ways, created the very template for the powerful and manipulative imperial woman, Livia Drusilla, the wife of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. Born into the Roman aristocracy, Livia was a woman of formidable intelligence and political acumen. When she married Octavian, the future Augustus, it was a political alliance, a union of two ambitious individuals who recognized in each other the same thirst for power. While Augustus was the public face of the new Roman order, Livia was the shrewd operator in the shadows, the whisper in his ear, the silent partner in his long and successful reign. The official story, the one propagated by Augustan propaganda, was of Livia as the ideal Roman matron, a devoted wife and a symbol of traditional Roman virtues. She was praised for her modesty, her dignity, and her dedication to her family. But behind this carefully constructed facade, a darker reputation began to fester, whispered in the secret corners of the Palatine Hill. It was a reputation that would be seized upon by later historians, most notably Tacitus, who painted Livia as a masterful dissembler, a woman who would stop at nothing to ensure the succession of her own son, Tiberius, from a previous marriage. The whispers began with the untimely deaths of Augustus's chosen heirs. First, there was Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and son-in-law, a promising young man who fell ill and died suddenly. Then came the deaths of Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandsons, who were seen as the most likely successors. Both died under mysterious circumstances while on provincial assignments. With each death, the path to the throne became clearer for Tiberius, and with each death, the rumors of Livia's involvement grew louder. It was said that she was a master of poisons, that she could concoct tasteless and untraceable toxins that could mimic the symptoms of natural illness. The historian Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, would state it as fact, claiming that Livia had a hand in the deaths of all of Augustus's potential heirs, the most damning accusation against Livia, however, concerned the death of Augustus himself. According to Dio, in the final year of his life, Augustus had begun to have second thoughts about Tiberius and was considering recalling his last surviving grandson, Agrippa Postumus, from exile. Livia, ever watchful, supposedly discovered this and decided to act. The story goes that she poisoned a batch of figs that were still on the tree, leaving some untouched for Augustus to pick himself, thus allaying any suspicion. The aged emperor ate the poisoned fruit and fell ill, his death paving the way for Tiberius to finally ascend to the imperial throne. True or not, the story of the poisoned figs has become an indelible part of Livia's legacy. It encapsulates the image of the cunning and ruthless woman who would commit the ultimate act of betrayal to achieve her goals. But was she truly a serial poisoner, a cold-blooded murderer who orchestrated the deaths of her own family members? Or was she a victim of a historical tradition that was deeply suspicious of powerful women? The truth, as is so often the case in the annals of history, is likely somewhere in between. Livia undoubtedly wielded immense influence over Augustus, and it is not beyond the realm of possibility that she used that influence to promote the career of her son. The Roman court was a hotbed of intrigue and conspiracy, and it is plausible that she engaged in the sort of political maneuvering that was necessary to survive and thrive in that environment. However, the accusations of murder are based largely on rumor and innuendo, recorded by historians who were writing long after the events and who were often hostile to the imperial family. Tacitus, our primary source for Livia's supposed crimes, had a clear anti-imperial bias and was particularly critical of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He saw in Livia the archetype of the wicked stepmother, a stock character in Roman literature, and he may have embellished his account to fit this narrative. What is undeniable is that Livia was a woman of extraordinary ability and ambition. She was a key figure in the establishment of the Roman Empire and a powerful force in her own right. She managed her own vast estates, engaged in diplomacy, and was a patron of the arts. She was, in many ways, a proto-empress, a woman who carved out a position of power and influence in a world that was designed to exclude her. The very fact that she was so feared and reviled by some is a testament to her success. In a society that expected women to be silent and submissive, Livia's voice was heard, and her actions had consequences that would shape the course of Roman history for generations to come. She set a dangerous precedent, demonstrating that a woman could be a major player in the game of Roman power, a lesson that would be learned and taken to even greater and more terrifying extremes by the woman who would follow in her footsteps. A woman who was her own great-granddaughter, Agrippina the Younger. The story of Agrippina the Younger is, if anything, even more dramatic and scandalous than that of her great-grandmother, Livia. While Livia operated in the shadows, Agrippina thrust herself into the spotlight, demanding a share of the power that she believed was her birthright. Born into the heart of the imperial family, she was the daughter of the celebrated general Germanicus and the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. From a young age, she was imbued with a sense of her own importance, a belief that she was destined to rule. Her life was a relentless and audacious climb to the pinnacle of power, a journey that would be marked by exile, incest, and murder. Agrippina's early life was tumultuous. Her father, a potential rival to Tiberius, died under suspicious circumstances, and her mother, Agrippina the Elder, a fierce and outspoken woman, was eventually exiled and starved to death. Agrippina the Younger learned early on that the imperial court was a dangerous place, and that survival depended on a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and a willingness to defy convention. Her first two marriages were strategic alliances, designed to enhance her wealth and influence. It was her third marriage, however, that would be her masterstroke. In a move that shocked Roman society, she seduced and married her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius. This incestuous union was a scandal, but for Agrippina, it was a necessary step on her path to power. She quickly consolidated her position, persuading the aging and easily manipulated Claudius to adopt her son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Barbus, and to name him as his heir, bypassing his own son, Britannicus. The boy's name was changed to Nero, and Agrippina began to groom him for the throne. She was not content to be merely the emperor's wife. She sought to be a co-ruler. She had coins minted with her own image alongside that of Claudius, and she attended meetings of the Senate, listening to the debates from behind a curtain, a symbolic and unprecedented assertion of female political authority. But Agrippina's ambition knew no bounds. Claudius, it seemed, was beginning to have regrets about disinheriting his own son. He was heard to mutter that it was his fate to suffer the crimes of his wives and then to punish them. Agrippina, ever vigilant, decided that she could not afford to wait for him to act. According to the ancient sources, she turned to the same method that her great-grandmother Livia was said to have perfected: poison. The historian Tacitus provides a detailed and chilling account of Claudius's murder. Agrippina, he writes, enlisted the help of a professional poisoner named Locusta to concoct a particularly potent toxin, which she then laced into a dish of mushrooms, a favorite food of the emperor. Claudius ate the poisoned mushrooms and fell gravely ill. When it seemed that he might recover, Agrippina, with the help of the emperor's doctor Xenophon, had a feather dipped in a fast-acting poison inserted down his throat, ostensibly to induce vomiting, but in reality to finish the job. With Claudius dead, the path was clear for Nero. At the age of just 16, he was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, a move that had been carefully orchestrated by Agrippina. In the early years of his reign, she was the true power behind the throne. She effectively ruled the Roman Empire, her ambition finally realized. But her triumph was to be short-lived. Nero, as he grew older, began to resent his mother's control. He was a young man of artistic pretensions and dissolute habits, and he chafed under her watchful eye. The relationship between mother and son, once a source of strength for Agrippina, now became a deadly rivalry. The final chapter of Agrippina's life is a gruesome and tragic tale of a power struggle that could only end in death. Nero, encouraged by his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, who despised Agrippina, decided that his mother had to be eliminated. But killing the most powerful woman in Rome was no easy task. Nero, ever the showman, devised a series of elaborate and theatrical plots to do away with her. First, he tried poison, but Agrippina, it was said, had built up an immunity by taking small doses of poison throughout her life. Then, he arranged for a mechanical ceiling in her bedroom to collapse, but she was warned and escaped. His most infamous attempt was a specially designed collapsible boat. He invited Agrippina to a banquet at his villa in Baiae and then sent her home in the booby-trapped vessel, which was designed to fall apart at sea. The boat did indeed collapse, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, managed to make it to shore. Her maid, in a moment of panic, cried out that she was Agrippina, hoping to be rescued, and was promptly clubbed to death by the oarsmen, who believed they were killing the empress. Agrippina, realizing the truth of her son's intentions, remained silent and swam to safety. Finally, abandoning all pretense of subtlety, Nero sent a team of assassins to her villa. When they burst into her bedroom, Agrippina, with a final act of defiance, is said to have bared her womb and cried out, "Strike! Here, for this bore Nero." The assassins stabbed her to death, and her body was unceremoniously cremated that same night. The matricide, a crime that horrified even the jaded Roman populace, would haunt Nero for the rest of his reign, a dark stain on his legacy that could never be washed away. The story of Agrippina the Younger is a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. She was a woman of immense talent and ambition, but she was also ruthless, manipulative, and ultimately self-destructive. Like her great-grandmother Livia, she has been portrayed by the ancient historians as a monster, a she-wolf who devoured her own young. And while it is true that she was responsible for numerous crimes, it is also true that she was a product of her time, a woman who had to be more ruthless and more cunning than any man to achieve her goals. Her story, like that of all the so-called worst women of Rome, is a complex and often contradictory one, a story that reveals as much about the society that produced her as it does about the woman herself, and what of the women who came after, the empresses who inherited the legacy of Livia and Agrippina. The annals of Roman history are filled with their stories, each one a variation on the theme of female ambition and male anxiety. There was Messalina, the third wife of Claudius, whose name has become synonymous with promiscuity and sexual depravity. The ancient sources, with a mixture of fascination and disgust, paint a portrait of a woman who was so insatiable that she would compete with a prostitute to see who could take the most lovers in a single night. She was accused of forcing high-ranking senators and their wives to participate in her orgies, and of using her position to eliminate her rivals and enrich herself. Her downfall came when she, while still married to Claudius, went through a public marriage ceremony with her lover, the consul designate Gaius Silius. This was an act of audacious rebellion that Claudius, prodded by his freedmen, could not ignore. Messalina and Silius were both executed, their story serving as a lurid and sensationalized warning against female licentiousness. But was Messalina truly the nymphomaniac monster that the historians described? Or was her reputation a deliberate fabrication, a way of discrediting a woman who was seen as a political threat? Some modern historians have suggested that the stories of her sexual excesses were exaggerated or even invented by her enemies, particularly by Agrippina the Younger, who succeeded her as Claudius's wife and had every reason to blacken her predecessor's name. The charge of sexual immorality was a common weapon used against powerful women in Rome, a way of undermining their authority and reducing them to their sexuality. It is possible that Messalina's real crime was not her promiscuity, but her political ambition, her attempt to create her own faction within the court and to secure the succession for her son, Britannicus. Then there were the Flavian Empresses who, while not as notorious as their Julio-Claudian predecessors, still had to navigate the treacherous waters of the imperial court. And later, in the 2nd century, came the powerful women of the Severan dynasty, such as Julia Domna, the wife of Septimius Severus, and her sister, Julia Maesa. These women, of Syrian origin, were highly educated and politically astute, and they wielded a level of influence that was unprecedented. Julia Domna was a patron of philosophers and writers, and she played a key role in the administration of the empire. Julia Maesa was even more ambitious, a kingmaker who, after the assassination of her nephew, the Emperor Caracalla, managed to have her own grandsons, Elagabalus and Alexander Severus, placed on the throne. The story of Elagabalus is one of the most bizarre and scandalous in all of Roman history. He was a teenage priest of a Syrian sun god who brought his strange and exotic religious practices to Rome. He was said to have dressed in women's clothing, to have prostituted himself in the imperial palace, and to have married a Vestal virgin, a sacrilege of the highest order. His reign was a short and chaotic one, and he was eventually murdered by the Praetorian Guard, along with his mother, Julia Soaemius. The ancient sources lay much of the blame for his excesses on the women of his family, particularly his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who was seen as the puppet master who had placed him on the throne for her own selfish ends. But again, we must ask ourselves how much of this is true and how much is propaganda. The reign of Elagabalus was a time of great cultural and religious conflict, and the traditional Roman elite were horrified by his foreign customs and his disregard for Roman tradition. It is possible that the stories of his sexual deviance and his mother's and grandmother's manipulations were exaggerated to justify his overthrow and to restore a more traditional Roman order under his cousin, Alexander Severus. What all of these stories have in common is a deep-seated anxiety about female power. In a society that was fundamentally patriarchal, the spectacle of a woman wielding influence, whether openly or behind the scenes, was both fascinating and terrifying. The worst women of Rome were the ones who dared to transgress the boundaries that had been set for them, who refused to be confined to the domestic sphere, and who competed with men in the ruthless game of politics. They were often accused of the same crimes: poison, sexual immorality, and an unnatural lust for power. These accusations were a way of pathologizing their ambition, of portraying it as a monstrous and unnatural deviation from the proper order of things. And yet, despite the best efforts of the male historians to demonize them, the stories of these women have endured. They continue to fascinate us because they are stories of rebellion, of individuals who, against all odds, managed to seize a measure of power and to leave their mark on history. They remind us that the story of Rome is not just a story of emperors and armies, but also a story of the complex and often brutal power dynamics that played out in the intimate spaces of the imperial palace. They force us to confront the biases of our historical sources and to question the narratives that have been handed down to us. Were these women truly the monsters that they were made out to be? Or were they simply women who were born into a world that was not ready for them, a world that could only understand their ambition as a form of wickedness? The answer, like the women themselves, is complex, elusive, and endlessly fascinating. The shadow empresses of Rome may have been condemned by history, but they have never been forgotten. Their stories, a potent cocktail of sex, power, and murder, continue to hold us in their thrall, a dark and compelling chapter in the epic tale of the Roman Empire. They are a testament to the enduring power of women to shape their own destinies, even in the most hostile of environments, and to the fact that sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that are hidden in the shadows.